welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I'm back in Berlin, Germany at the DDR Museum, which I would say is one of the most innovative and exciting immersive museums that I have visited. And I want to use this opportunity to talk to you about dark topics, which can be deep, disturbing, existential issues that you wouldn't typically find in other spaces. And here we see an example at the DDR Museum of a lighter issue, some nude sunbathers, and a portrayal through a diorama of how people experience leisure time during these turbulent eras in the former East Germany. And I think it's quite interesting that theme parks are accustomed to presenting happier or lighter topics. But using this opportunity to look at some of the exhibitions here at the DDR Museum, we first see that there's an emphasis on presenting the guest with something entirely different. And in this case, I feel there's a metaphor at play here. Many examples of exhibition spaces here where there's an image, a panel, that is to be opened and explored in further detail. And as a deep existential metaphor, I feel as if they're trying to create this attitude in the guest as he or she visits the space that there is something dark and disturbing beneath the surface of some of the things we might encounter in the world. And I think this is an effective metaphor that they use. And here we find another example, an emphasis on surveillance that was very common during this historical period in Germany. And again, I think it's incumbent on the guest, through the interactive displays, to reflect on this in an existential way. As we think about contemporary surveillance relative to the NSA in the United States and the Edward Snowden revelations, this is a topic that is very much on the minds of people, and certainly guests who visit this immersive space. So I think, again, this is an important and metaphorical way for the guest to think about the many issues that are tied in with this period of time, and surveillance, of course, and the East German state as a spy state is a very important topic that has to be broached with the guest in an immersive space like the DDR Museum. And here, as we enter another section in the museum, we encounter yet another example of using interactive means to deal with troubling issues. In this case, we're not talking about the previous issue of surveillance, but we're dealing with ideological issues. And indeed, in some ways, this aspect of the museum is perhaps a bit controversial. I've spoken with colleagues who also study theming, and they feel that in some cases, this particular portrayal is a bit heavy-handed. And so we're coming up on an exhibit, I think, here that again acts as an interactive device, but is also quite metaphorical. So the whole premise of this particular device is to focus on the political party in the DDR, and specifically asks the guests to use this device. And you can see here that there's quite a bit of signage in the museum that also I think reflects the political tendencies and the efforts in this museum to get the guests to think about some of the consequences, in this case the existential consequences of this period in history. And the point about this particular machine is that you crank the dial and all the hands on all the figures in the machine who represent the political party move at exactly the same time. And you can see here another diorama, another representation of material culture, in which I think a similar point is made about the nature of the party's state, and exactly if the individual has any role, or could be even called an individual in such a state. And this is a common theme of the museum, I believe, is to focus on this issue of how the socialist system didn't allow for any individuality. And here we have another example of typical household goods that further focuses on the issue of scarcity common in this time period. And now we're coming upon a prison cell. And this is an example, I think, of using material culture in a space in such a way that you are trying to startle the guest, you are trying to disturb his or her sensibilities, and perhaps to create some kind of existential connection to that guest. In this case, you have to reflect on what it was like to live during the time of the Stasi, which of course was the secret police apparatus that affected so many people who lived in East Germany, essentially creating a system of surveillance and spying. And as I've heard it described by people, Germans who lived through this period of history, it was a dark and disturbing time, and indeed you never knew exactly who was your friend and who was your enemy, and most people were forced, co-opted into participating in this surveillance system, often implicating their friends and family members. So I think this is an important message focus to emphasize in the museum. And here in this last case, there's a interrogation that occurs, and as you can see here, you sit on one side of the table, and it's very interactive. Again, none of this part of the museum is done in fun, and this is me on the opposite side of the interrogation table. And the whole point of this is to try to get the guest to see. You can never replicate, obviously, the disturbing nature of an interrogation under the Stasi, but you can at least get the guest to make an existential connection and to think more deeply about the implications of what was a dark and disturbing time in cultural and political history in Germany. So I think it's important that spaces like this use and emphasize dark topics. This is not necessarily a theme park, and so I think it's quite appropriate for such dark topics to be discussed in this themed and immersive space.